Hi everyone. Okay, here we go. So here I am, Miss Reinhardt, talking to you from my living room, and I would be outside, except for it's not quite warm enough yet. So here I am, hair freshly washed, no makeup, sitting here on my couch, going to get ready to start our story times. A few things you should know first. I am not a professional actress. I do not do accents. So I'm going to read books to you just as if I was reading them to my boys when they were younger. I'm not going to make things perfect. There's going to be mistakes. I'm going to pause. I'm going to ask you questions. I'm really just going to read. Now, don't forget, there are lots of other places to get people reading you books. We have ebooks. We have audiobooks. You all should know by now how to access those. But I'm going to remind you in the tutorials on how to do that in a little bit. So if you don't want me reading you the book, there are many other places to get books read to you or to read books online. You don't even need to go to the library if you can't do that. There's going to be a spot for picture books, for elementary books, for middle school books, and for high school books, all from my proto page. I'm going to make mistakes. I think I already said that. Want to make sure to repeat that. I'm going to make mistakes. And that's just part of it. My goal for each book is to read about 30 minutes per day. So a picture book we should get through in no problem, one book at a time. But an elementary school book, it might take 2 days to get through. A middle school book, it might take 5 days to get through. And a high school book, well, maybe I'll do short stories for high schoolers, just for them. But we'll see. We'll see how this goes. And there'll be a place that you can make requests. So let's just get started, shall we? Okay, for grades 5 through 8, we're going to start with the Ranger's Apprentice series. Just the first book, The Ruins of Gorlan. And this series has about 12 books in just the main series itself. It's one of my all-time favorite series ever. I've read it probably a dozen times. And my youngest son, Joshua, this has long been one of his favorite series also. He's read most of the books several times. So to get started, let's view a little movie book trailer. All right, so let's dive in. Josh, when he was younger, wouldn't read any books that didn't have knights and swords in them somewhere. So this is an action-adventure book. It is slight fantasy. It's the only book in the series that really has any kind of fantasy components. The enemy in this book is not something that could actually exist. That's not my favorite part of the book. But the main characters, Will and Horace and the rest of them, they're fantastic. So let's get going. I'm going to admit that I actually don't like the prologue to this book. I think once you get into chapter 1 and get going on the book, I think it's excellent. But the prologue, it's a couple pages long, it's a couple minutes long. I told my boys, skim the prologue. It's kind of confusing. Don't worry about it. Just start with chapter 1 and later go back and read the prologue. So I did start the reading with the prologue, but if you're feeling yourself, you're listening going, I don't know, or I'm confused, skip the prologue, just go to chapter 1, or just give me a little bit more time and then you'll see. This, before we get started, is a map of the area. So most of our story takes place here in the country, the land called Arlowen. This is Picta, which to me is kind of like Scotland, and Celtica, which the Celts would be like Ireland. So it's not at all the same as the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, and Ireland, and where they're at and all that kind of stuff. But you can see this is the world map. This is kind of where it is right now, and this is where we're at right now. So it does. There are some real similarities to Europe here, or really, 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 really old Europe. And here is Morgorath. He's going to be in the prologue right here. This is the bad guy. This is where he's hanging out. Gorlan, this is called the Ruins of Gorlan. So this is going to be a main place in the book. Redmont is where one of the main barons lives. This is swords and knights and fiefdoms and barons and all that kind of stuff. And here is the town, the city, the castle of Arluan in the country. And Norgate is where another castle is, and Caraway. In the prologue, it's going to talk about the Battle of Hackham Heath, and so this is kind of the place. And anytime you want to come back to this map, well, the world of John Flanagan, the author, you can find this map and lots of other information. Let's get started. Prologue. Morgorath, Lord of the Mountains of Rain and Night, former Baron of Gorlan, in the kingdom of Arluan, looked out over his bleak, rain-swept domain, and for perhaps the 1000th time, cursed. This was all that was left to him now. A jumble of rugged granite cliffs, tumbled boulders, and icy mountains, of sheer gorges and steep, narrow passes, of gravel and rock, with never a tree or a sign of green to break the monotony. Even though it had been 15 years since he had been driven back into this forbidding realm that had become his prison, he could still remember the pleasant green glades and thickly forested hills of his former fief. The streams filled with fish and the fields rich with crops and game. Gorlan had been a beautiful, living place. The mountains of rain and night were dead and desolate. A platoon of wargals was drilling in the castle yard below him. Morgorath watched them for a few seconds, listening to the guttural, rhythmic chant that accompanied all their movements. They were stocky, misshapen beings, with features that were halfway human, but with a long, brutish muzzle and fangs like a bear or a large dog. Avoiding all contact with humans, the wargals had lived and bred in these remote mountains since ancient times. No one in living memory had ever set eyes upon one, but rumors and legends had persisted of a savage tribe of semi-intelligent beasts in the mountains. Morgorath, planning a revolt against the kingdom of Arluan, had left Gorlan Fief to seek them out. If such creatures existed, they would give him an edge in the war that was to come. It took him months, but he eventually found them. Aside from their wordless chant, Wargles had no spoken communication, no spoken language, relying on a primitive form of thought awareness for communication. But their minds were simple and their intellects basic. As a result, they had been totally susceptible to domination by a superior intelligence and willpower. Morgorath bent them to his will, and they became the perfect army for him. Ugly beyond nightmares, utterly pitiless, and bound totally to his mental orders. Now looking at them, he remembered the brightly dressed knights in glittering armor who used to compete in tourneys at Castle Gorlan, their silk-gowned ladies cheering them on and applauding their skills. Mentally comparing them to these black-furred, misshapen creatures, he cursed again. The Wargles, attuned to his thoughts, sensed his disturbance and stirred uncomfortably, pausing in what they were doing. Angrily, he directed them back to their drill, and the chanting resumed. Morgorath moved away from the unglazed window, closer to the fire that seemed utterly incapable of dispelling the damp and chill from this gloomy castle. 15 years, he thought to himself again. 15 years since he had rebelled against the newly crowned King Duncan, a youth in his 20s. He had planned it all carefully as the old king's sickness progressed, banking on the indecision and confusion that would follow his death to split the other barons and give Morgorath his opportunity to seize the throne. Secretly, he had trained his army of Wargles, massing them up here in the mountains, ready for the moment to strike. Then in the days of confusion and grief following the king's death, when the barons traveled to Castle Ireland for the funeral rites, leaving their armies leaderless, he had attacked, overrunning the southeastern corner of the kingdom in a matter of days, routing the confused, leaderless forces that tried to oppose him. This part here that I've highlighted has always made me think that the kingdom of Ireland is really a lot like England. So it has a king, and he's a young king in this time, and there's lots of other barons. So the kingdom is split up into different fiefdoms, and that's all very English. So I think a lot of it definitely reminds me of England. Duncan, young and experienced, could never have stood against him. The kingdom was his for the taking. The throne was his for the asking. Then Lord Nordholt, the old king's supreme army commander, had rallied some of the younger barons into a loyal confederation, giving strength to Duncan's resolve and stiffening the wavering courage of the others. The armies had met at Hackham Heath, close by the Slipsunder River, and the battle swayed in the balance for 5 hours, with attack and counterattack and massive loss of life. The Slipsunder was a shallow river, but its treacherous reaches of quicksand and soft mud had formed an impassable barrier, protecting Morgorath's right flank. But then one of those gray-cloaked meddlers, known as Rangers, led a force of heavy cavalry across a secret ford. A ford is a river. To ford a river, that's kind of how it comes about. 10 kilometers upstream. The armored horsemen appeared at the crucial moment of the battle and fell upon the rear of Morgorath's army. We're going to cut that part out. But then one of those gray-cloaked meddlers, known as Rangers, led a force of heavy cavalry across a secret ford 10 kilometers upstream. Maybe you've heard that phrase before: to ford a river means to be able to cross the river. The armored horsemen appeared at the crucial moment of the battle and fell upon the rear of Morgorath's army. The Wargals, trained in the tumbled rocks of the mountains, had one weakness. They feared horses and could never stand against such a surprise cavalry attack. They broke, retreating to the narrow confines of Three-Step Pass, and went to the mountains of Rain and Night. Morgorath, his rebellion defeated, went with them. And here he had been exiled these 15 years, waiting, plotting, hating the men who had done this to him. Now, he thought, it was time for revenge. His spies told him the kingdom had grown slack and complacent, and his presence here was all but forgotten. The name Morgorath was a name of legend nowadays, a name mothers use to hush fractious children. You know, kids who are causing them problems, being a pain, threatening that if they did not behave, the Black Lord Morgorath would come for them. The time was ripe. Once again, he would lead his Wargals into an attack. But this time, he would have allies. And this time, he would sow the ground with uncertainty and confusion beforehand. This time, none of those who conspired against him previously would be left alive to aid King Duncan. For the Wargals were not the only ancient, terrifying creatures he had found in these somber mountains. He had two other allies, even more fearsome: the dreadful beasts known as the Calcara. The time was ripe to unleash them.